Right, it is 11 o'clock. So I think we are going to get going. To today's final Groundsure and CDS webinar. For those of you that have joined us quite frequently this year, thank you ever so much for your time. I really hope these sessions have been very useful, and I hope you enjoyed them somewhat. As always, a little bit of housekeeping before I finish off this year's last webinar. So we are recording today's session, and of course we have a copy of the slides should you want either of those. So please do let us know after the webinar is finished and we'll get those over to you. There will be a final feedback survey and we'd always appreciate your feedback. So that should take a couple of seconds to answer, which will launch at the very, very end of this webinar. I am still working from home, but hopefully you should all hear me clearly and there are no technical issues. We have had a few technical issues with the slides in the last couple of sessions. So I'm hoping that today that's not going to happen and that you can see the slides and hear me clearly. Should anything happen or should anything cut out during the webinar, please do let me know and we will get a copy of the recording and the slides over to you. So my sincere apologies if there are any technical issues, and I'm hoping that this storm that seems to be rolling in isn't going to knock any internet or anything out. So crossing fingers, this will be a technical glitch-free webinar for today. As always, there is a control panel on your screen which allows you to ask written questions. Please do feel free to submit them as we go along, and we'll get these answered either during or after the webinar. So let's get this session going. So this is our agenda for today. Really, 2021, what a year. It's been incredibly busy. It's been incredibly up and down and varied and interesting. So we're going to start by taking a look back at what we've been doing this year and then look at the various markets that we all may work in all of them or work in some of them. But yeah, we're going to start with kind of a little bit of a quick recap. Here's our timeline for this year. I think if I'm being perfectly honest, the first half of this year seems like a lifetime ago. It's kind of weird to think about where we were a year ago with the various lockdowns that we were in, and the previous Christmas and whatnot, but we got through it in the end with some pretty interesting, weird, and wonderful world events happening over the past year in the US with the Trump supporters storming the Capitol building, us going into lockdown earlier this year, and then the big vaccine rollout. And sort of in the middle of the year, things were starting to feel a little bit normal again, which is quite nice. Being reunited with our loved ones, the housing market, of course, booming as it was, following on from 2020 and the madness that was. And then moving on to kind of the latter half of the year seems to be a little bit more up and down, I would say. And then, of course, the frantic changing of the rules, COP26, all of that weird and wonderful stuff. So I think it's really important for all of us to just take a step back and actually look at the year that we've all had and how crazy it's been. And certainly from my perspective, hats off to all of the conveyancers and the solicitors this year that have been working incredibly, incredibly hard. So hats off to you for dealing with all of that. So let's take a look at the residential property market. Now, we have gotten, this information from varying sources. So there is a collation of various sources. Of course, Q4 isn't completely finished yet, so we're trying to provide you as much information from complete quarters. Now, here are some comparison figures from the wonderful people at 20CI, comparing 2019 versus 2021. The residential property market, as we all know, has been incredibly busy. We've seen volumes go through the roof since the property market reopened in May of last year, which seems like a lifetime ago. It was helped along by things like the SDLT holiday, which I'm sure quite a few of you are glad that's over. And really from 20CI's perspective, and I think quite a lot of the experts trying to compare 2021 to 2020 probably isn't a very good measure or a very steady measure or a very realistic measure, because really we all know that 2020 was a bit like all over the place and insane. So they have chosen not to do that direct comparison because of the turmoil in the pandemic delivered, and instead chose to compare 2019 to 2021 to provide a kind of more realistic, more steady view of market conditions pre-pandemic. And the momentum within the residential property market has continued to deliver a significant volume of activity since the reopening of the property market in 2020. So you can see kind of the figures we put up on the screen. Again, fairly comparable. You look at the sales agreed and the exchange numbers. Again, 2021 seems to definitely come up on top. The interesting thing will be, of course, the new instructions. We all know that there's a huge amount of lack of supply, as it were. We've also seen a huge amount of property delays slowly easing, with the conveyancing logjam starting to finally ease. The average time from a sale being agreed until a purchase completes has dropped from an average of 154 days in July of this year to 127 days in October, and hopefully continuing a downward trend and getting even shorter as of course the months have gone by. Now, the average time between 2017 and 2019 was 3.5 months, so 104 days. So although conveyancing times haven't fully recovered yet, the time to find a buyer is still at an all-time low of 37 days nationally, meaning the total time sellers should be allowing is roughly about 5.5 months. Rightmove estimate that the number of homes currently going through the legal process is about 550,000, less than the 700,000 recorded in June, but it's still 41% higher than October of 2019. With 1.2 million transactions so far this year, Rightmove's analysis also suggests that of the current home movers going through the conveyancing process, an estimated 300,000 could complete in time for Christmas. 2021 could see 1.5 million transactions, which is the highest number of sales since 2007. That's 47% higher than in 2020 and 31% higher than in 2019. So still, really incredible numbers when you think about it. I am hoping to be one of those people that might actually exchange or complete before Christmas, but that is looking unlikely now. The government target for returning local searches is a maximum of 10 working days. We all know that varies wildly depending on where you are in the country. Recent turnaround times reveal that some local authorities are still taking between 35 to 60 days to return searches. So that is unfortunate. That is the reality that we are living in. But unfortunately, delays are still happening and things are still taking a fair amount of time. Now, there are projects that are being worked on. We all know, of course, that HMLR are continuing to increase their digital services, which should hopefully speed things up for everybody. They've been working on various things to speed things up for everybody with multiple title register update applications, which can now be launched through the digital registration service and portal. They're looking at increasing all of their digital services. I know that they're certainly working on new digital services. If anybody's interested, they actually have a digital roadmap available on their website if you want to see what is happening, what they're actually working on and rolling out sort of in the coming year. And certainly interesting for some of you, as it may be, of course, helping you speed things up. In terms of property values, we've put some stats up on the screen for you. Now, the average asking price across the UK in Q3 of this year was 388,000 compared to 345,000 in Q3 of 2019. So that's an increase of about 12.5%. If you compare the same periods of time for 2019 versus 2021. Now, with a sustained high level of sales agreed and no significant increase in properties coming to the market because of the lack of available properties, it's actually continuing to drive up prices as demand currently significantly exceeds supply. So we know this. And every region of the UK has experienced an increase in average asking prices, albeit inner London, which was seeing the lowest growth, and reflects a significant impact of the pandemic on the capital. Now, property prices have been able to climb for home sellers since May of last year because of the level of demand, which has far outweighed the influx in supply. Also, of course, the SDLT holiday, everybody said, and everybody was saying it in the industry, that the SDLT had completely pushed the prices up of houses as well. With less properties on the market to choose from, and with a lot of greater competition from other home buyers offering above asking prices, home buyers have had no choice but to offer inflated prices. And this shift in power between the sellers and buyers have determined actually the new market position. And again, this is the result of the ongoing national reevaluation of housing. Low mortgage rates, the additional boost from the extended SDLT holiday, and the strength of market conditions aren't just a result of the SDLT holiday alone. And of course, greater forces are shaping the market. And this is evidenced by the fact that there doesn't seem to be a sign. Everybody was talking about cliff edge. Is there going to be a cliff edge? There isn't. Of course, people have varying opinions on that, but there doesn't seem to be a sign of a cliff edge in demand for homes, which continue to run 25 to 30% above the 5-year average since the summer. So it's a pretty incredible number. Now, if you're looking at more recent headlines, like talking about October, November time, because of course we've only just finished November, according to The Guardian, UK house prices returned to double-digit growth in November, up from 9.9% in October, according to the nationwide index. And house prices have continued to go up as demand has stayed strong even after the end of the SDLT holiday and even after the end of the furlough. So I think people had kind of forgotten that the furlough was ending, or, well, depending on where you were and where you worked. But certainly the end of furlough, people were a bit worried about, understandably so, how that was going to impact people's affordability. So it's just been really rise on rise on rise. And of course, with the rates being so low, it's kind of been quite, I guess, ideal in terms of an interest rate perspective. Activity has been very, very buoyant in 2021. And the number of housing transactions so far this year has already exceeded the number recorded in 2020, with still, I mean, I'm not going to say a month to go, a few weeks to go, if that. And it's pretty much tracking close to the numbers seen at the same stage in 2007 before the global financial crisis struck. So a really interesting time, really, really busy still. And I'm not going to lie, I feel very fortunate to work in the industry that we do, because I know other industries have suffered so much since the pandemic. And just, it would be silly not to talk about stock. I think stock is a huge, huge, huge issue and will continue to be a big issue. And we have a distinct lack of residential property stock coming onto the market. Compared to Q3 of 2019, there are 9% fewer new instructions, while sales agreed are 16.5% greater. Demand throughout this year has consistently exceeded supply. There is also some evidence of a slowdown in a rate of price inflation. Price inflation is definitely one that's been in the news recently. Depending on who you talk to, it's going to be 3%, it's going to be 5%. It's all kind of a sea change, but hopefully we are starting to see a little bit more of normality. I think everybody's kind of sitting back to see where we are getting through this winter. So that will be the big reveal will be how well and how well the country does trying to get through this winter. So hopefully, crossing fingers, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I'm just going to briefly touch on the commercial property market, and investment volumes for the year to date currently stand at 42 billion, meaning it is all but certain that the final year volumes will exceed last year's and exceed the 50 billion mark. With rising inflation and discussions now taking place as to when interest rates are going to rise rather than if, many commentators are discussing if further inward yield movements can actually be maintained. The more important thing to remember is that commercial property prices have a relatively loose link with inflation and a much stronger one with economic growth. So with UK GDP forecast to rise by roughly about 5% next year, it is hard to justify wholesale upward yield movement into the near term. And this is based on information from Savills and the Saville market research from October. Now, investor sentiment in the industrial sector remains very high. By the end of Q3, volumes have reached 12 billion, already exceeding the previous annual record of 10.9 billion, accounting for 29% of the total market. Again, this is the highest ever level. New planning policies, and I'm going to say new, they're kind of all in change after the Queen's speech in May last year. And then, of course, all of the changes that, the overhaul that I guess Michael Gove and his team are doing. There's definitely a lot of sea change, and people are watching what's going to be happening to the planning policies in the coming year. The new planning policies will increase costs to logistics developers. Now, buildings currently contribute some 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but this could triple by 2050 if action isn't taken now, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Research. New development will be forced to take on more of a share of ambitious targets, and the planning system will be key to enforcing these targets. Local authorities will be central to the functioning of the new duties being imposed by the government through the forthcoming Environment Act. Speculative developments account for 22% of all of the warehouse space taken in the UK, as occupiers need the flexibility to be able to take speculative buildings when they're in rapid expansion mode. As build to suit takes a lot longer to buy. Now, larger corporate occupiers are now more aware than ever of their own ESG targets, and many newly constructed warehouses are achieving net zero status. So a huge amount of EPCs and how are these buildings, how are their net zero status and how are their climate outputs being measured, et cetera, et cetera. That's all being looked at, certainly a lot more in the coming future. In terms of construction and planning, construction activity has recovered strongly since the start of the year, as the vaccine rollout and progressive unlocking of the economy started to rebuild our confidence, and the value of underlying project starts during the 3 months to May rose by 20% and was 70% higher than when the UK was in the midst, of course, the first national lockdown back in 2020. So after the sharp initial upturn, a steadier progressive strengthening in project starts is anticipated over the forecast period. So by next year, we now expect the value of underlying starts, so projects with a construction value of less than 100 million, to total 54.2 billion. So that's 3% above 2019 levels. So it's nice. It's a nice increase. However, the recovery isn't necessarily going to be evenly spread, with regional and sector champions reflecting a changing UK economic and social landscape. So we know that within this pandemic, certain industries have boomed. Warehousing, logistics, people with online businesses that require all these warehousing and logistics have all expanded. In addition, the current shortage of construction materials highlights the potential impact of supply side constraints on the pace of recovery over the next 2 years. Supply chain is a really integral part of what we're doing. We've talked about this all year. A combination of the pandemic and Brexit have caused major disruptions to the supply chain. The limited ability of diverse selection of construction products has prompted concerns over industry capacity and the cost and timely delivery of projects. Whether it's residential housing or commercial, it's all being impacted, along with, of course, all of the household products that we use and all of the things that we're all ordering primarily online, not to mention the labor. Now, Glenigan's predict that the current shortages will ease by next year as manufacturers' operating levels rise and the current disruption to global logistics networks dissipates. Post-Brexit structural changes, however, are expected to reduce the ready availability of EU-sourced products. So we know that that's going to be impacted, and we are going to not necessarily as easily get EU-sourced products. When you think about things like imported materials, domestically produced construction products account for the vast majority of materials used by the UK construction industry, which is good. However, imported materials totaled 18.1 billion during 2019, accounting for 24% of construction products used in the country. overseas source products account for a high proportion of some materials, including things like timber, electrical wires and fittings, and plumbing and heating equipment. Extended lead times and restricted product availability in these areas can have a disproportionate impact on project schedules and costs. So we know things are getting delayed. We know that this all has a knock-on effect. I mean, it even like trying to get workmen and labor to come and do projects for individual houses is certainly been pushed back. You have issues with staff and shipping. Many construction product manufacturing operations have been disrupted over the last year by the pandemic. You've got suspension of operations, you've got reduced staffing levels, you've got, of course, the lack of HGV drivers, the delivery of manufactured products, especially from the Far East, has been disrupted by a shortage of containers, shipping and port capacity due to the disruption of trade flows caused by the initial lockdown. And I don't know if anybody remembers that massive shipping container was at the Evergreen that got stuck in one of the canals, where a lot of internet memes came out from that, which is quite funny. We've also got silly things like panic buying, and of course these factors resulted in extended lead times for quite a few products and prompted increased ordering by some contractors seeking to make sure they actually had enough supply for their projects. You've got sites like HS2, which is another controversy on its own, depending on which part of the country you live in. They've increased demand for materials and labor as well. And of course, the ever looming Brexit, we really still don't have an idea of how that's going to impact us, but we know it is impacting us either way. So just bearing that in mind, that's going to affect us, I think, and it's going to continue to disrupt us in the coming year, if not longer. The Ministry of Housing. So in terms of leveling up, it's the term that everybody's been using in terms of the government and the leveling up program. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government will now become the Department of Leveling Up Housing and Communities. And the Leveling Up program is one set out by the government to reach tangible improvements in every part of the UK as we build back from the pandemic and deliver on the people's priorities. So in response to the widening of socioeconomic divisions during the pandemic, the government has reaffirmed its commitment to leveling up. And while much of the focus of that has been on things like road, rail, and regeneration, according to PwC, 70% of the public say that a focus on housing would be the most effective way to level up the country and reduce inequality. And they rate quality almost as highly as affordability. And of course, with all of the uproar and upheaval of last year and this year, it's really forced people to lead their lives much closer to home. So for a lot of people, it was a welcome opportunity to spend more time in their homes and their communities. But for those with small, substandard homes, it has brought to the forefront longstanding issues of affordability, quality, and equality. And the program of investment in creating new affordable homes looked a reminder of the many initiatives currently in place to support new housing. So Robert Jenrick's First Homes plan is currently underway, with Rishi Sunak pledging a 20% increase on the previous investment program. 11.5 billion is to be set aside for new build homes, and a 1.8 billion commitment made to unlocking 1,500 hectares of brownfield sites to help deliver 160,000 new homes. So touching on the brownfield sites, I think I have mentioned this before in previous webinars, and particularly when it comes to contaminated land, brownfield sites are definitely going to be key in order to be able to meet these housing targets. You will probably have clients that are looking more and more at brownfield sites, which is why it's really important to understand what is there, because we're running out of places to build housing. And so there's all sorts of factors that all are integrated together to make this work. You've also got things like the planning bill, of course, which we know the original housing target was 300,000 new homes built per year. Whether or not we're actually going to hit that is another question. The initial kind of proposal for the planning bill was that local authorities were going to have to classify all land in their areas as either growth, renewal, or protection, growth being automatic permission, renewal being permission in principle, and protection is a no build. So again, that initial proposal came out, and then there was a lot of uproar and resistance, and now I believe it's being re-looked at and overhauled. So one thing to just bear that in mind, and this is something we're certainly keeping an eye on for next year as well. Now, looking a bit further into the future. So let's take a quick look at residential forecasts. Now, let me make the disclaimer that it really depends on who you talk to as to what the predictions are, and they do vary. Nobody has a crystal ball, and at this rate, given, of course, the new variant, nobody really knows what impact it's going to have on the wider economy, at least in the short term. Now, the property, depending on who you're talking to, so the property portal's research forecasts a 3% increase in UK house prices over the course of 2022. And this is across a predicted 1.2 million housing transactions. More than a fifth of households plan to move over the next 18 months as a direct result of the pandemic, or the continuing result of the pandemic, in a survey done by Zoopla. People are more likely to move, the people that were more likely to move and saying they were more likely to move were actually younger people who lived in cities, suburbs, or larger towns, and people whose working patterns have changed permanently. There's been a lot of reassessment of people's lifestyle and reevaluation of people's housing needs. Flexible working is now a reality, and it has become more common. And so there is a big question about these big city centers and whether or not they're actually going to get back to pre-pandemic levels, because people don't have to be near their work as much as they used to. So following a change in working patterns, it's likely to see a continued move to other cities and towns, with some still wanting a very much rural lifestyle. And according to Zoopla, the main drivers for the sector will be, again, looking at what you actually need in terms of your house, increasing housing equity, and again, moving to this hybrid working, and what people can actually afford. And as always, there will be polarization across the country, with the biggest price hikes expected to continue in the Northwest. Really, really like emerging housing market, you're looking at plus 4% at least. London remains the slowest part of the country, with rises forecast to be around 2% for next year. And these increases forecast overall are more sustainable. So we're looking at not necessarily massive increases, but more sustainable ones. Right now, towns like Blackburn and Rochdale in the Northwest are seeing price growth of more than 10%. Places like Liverpool and Manchester seem to be leading the country, with annual house price rises of 1.4 and 8.7% respectively in those two places. The Bank of England base rate remains at a record low, but most experts are expecting this to rise in the near future. And this will more likely have a knock-on effect on mortgage rates. And it's one of the reasons buyers like myself, who were a bit on the fence about buying, actually were spurred on to invest sooner rather than later. Mortgage rates have been so low, and the market in general has gotten so used to it. But there are predictions that rates will average out at roughly about 3% by the end of next year, which is the highest it'll be since 2015. But actually, when you think about it, it's still very, very low in the grand scheme of things. If we're talking about the span of decades, 3% is actually still very, very low. Now, if you look at what Savills has forecasted, specifically around the Greater London area, in an article published last month, they're saying that as international travel gets easier, although there's a question mark about how easy that's getting, the number of buyers looking at purchasing property in prime central London, so we're talking like really, really central London is going to rise and will likely have a big impact on the market next year. Flats, like small 1-2 bed flats, really took a hit from 2020 and early 2021, but the demand for flats in the second half of this year is balancing out and basically increasing and on the rise. Savills say that the 2022 forecast for prime central London will be 8%, and a 5-year price forecast of 23.9%. So slowly coming back if you're looking at that very exclusive middle part of London. If you're looking at the outer edges of London, it's a little bit more balanced, and they've predicted a forecast of 4% in 2022 and 13.7% over 5 years. And of course, because of the pandemic, the area beyond London and sort of outside the M25 or in the outer rims of it price has been driven by demand, by people looking to upsize into bigger family homes. So again, it's all about supply and demand. If interest rates and taxes rise, it'll slowly squeeze people's spending power, which could soften the rate of house price growth. And given how strong the price growth has been in the last few years, it's likely bound to happen. In addition to, of course, not just the interest rates and the tax rises, but also things like utilities. There's been a lot of talk about energy companies this year that have gone bust and how the prices are going up for our energy and our utilities. And as much as I even hate to talk about 2024, people also may have forgotten it's a general election year, and that does actually impact certain markets depending on where you are in the country. Long term, the price difference between markets like the southeast of England, Scotland, the Midlands, and Northern England really means that there's more growth capacity for places like the Midlands and Northern England. And that has come to, that is being demonstrated over the last few years. Areas like the Northwest, Northern England, the Midlands have all been doing really, really well, and they are set to be the top performing regions in the next 5 years. What else? Looking into 2022, the outlook for price inflation and overall sales volume is basically a balance of positive and negative influences. So on the positive side, housing remains, and I'm going to say in air quotes here, affordable in many markets, and competition amongst lenders will remain intense, even if mortgage rates do increase, which we know they're going to. In addition, some analysis shows that the impact of the pandemic on people's buying decisions is still going to continue. It's still going to be a factor in people buying. Again, so it really is a real mixture of things for next year, with the cost of living increases, tax levels of inflation, tax increases, mortgage rates increasing. So we'll definitely see what is going to happen. We're all going to be, I guess, seeing how it all plays out. Zoopla did more research and more surveys, and they actually found that 22% of households remain eager or very eager to move because of the pandemic. So still a big number of people are going to be moving. They're going to be moving to those places we discussed earlier. And it's basically going to continue on, maybe not at such a frantic pace as 2020 and early 21, but still continuing to be quite strong. In terms of commercial, the construction output is forecasted to rise by 13.7% and a further 6.3% in 2022, despite material shortages and price rises. Infrastructure output is expected to rise by 23.4% this year. And that's really some of the major projects like Hinkley Point C, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and the HS2 are all contributing factors to that, which is why it's so high. Weak UK growth and the disruption to UK business revenues and confidence deters private sector investment in most non-residential sectors. You've got greater public sector investment, which fuels recovery in social housing, health, schools, and civil engineering. We've got a belated, so when I said I felt really fortunate being in the industry that we are in conveyancing and the property industry, people, sectors like hotel and leisure have had a much slower post-pandemic recovery. And so that is going to continue to go along slowly. The big one for next year from a commercial perspective, online retailing, because it's going to be the catalyst for increased investment in logistics facilities. If you've driven up the M1 anytime recently, you know that Amazon has an enormous distribution center along the M1, and they're also building another one. So that is going to continue, and it's probably going to continue in and around those areas that are best placed in the country for quick delivery to the rest of the country. So if you are in the commercial conveyancing sector, I would be really interested to know whether or not you do have more people looking at warehousing and logistics and looking to build those places out, because it seems like that's not going to go away. We have, of course, post-Brexit customs regulations and non-tariff barriers that's going to continue to disrupt supply chains. So that's something that we are keeping an eye on and just trying to see where the growth and where, the very slow recovery, but it is happening. So commercial next year, again, going to be a really interesting one, and you're going to see which industries are going to be doing really well. And like I say, housing, logistics, transport, distribution, those are all going to be certainly on the up from what we can see so far in terms of the data. So definitely one to watch. And that is pretty much it. Nice and short for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found today's session useful and interesting, and we hope that you join us for next year's new webinar program. We are in the process of building that out with CDS for next year. We're going to be looking at things like some of the main themes for next year will be things like compliance, will be climate change. We're going to have a sector on educating new conveyancers. So those are all things and topics that we're going to be looking at for next year. So if you have any ideas or any recommendations of topics you would like us to cover for next year, please do let us know, because we'd really, really love to hear that from you so we can build that into the sessions for next year. And if you ever do want any in-house or online CPD training sessions, please do speak to either your CDS account manager or your preferred reseller. We are able to get that arranged for you, bespoke for your company and your organization. And there's no charge for that as well. So we always want to be able to help educate where we can. And that is pretty much it for me. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope I will see some of you again online next year. And yeah, just well done to everybody for getting through 2021, and hopefully, crossing fingers, 2022 will be nice and busy for everyone. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the afternoon. There will be a feedback survey popping up just shortly.